A warm welcome to the Security Brief. So the Trump White House continues to defend its leaking of text messages regarding airstrikes in Yemen, claiming that there was no breach of classified information. Meanwhile, discussions held in Riyadh in Saudi Arabia for a ceasefire in Ukraine seem to be progressing, but are US officials becoming too aligned with the Kremlin? Well, as always, joining me is Mikey Kay, a former assault helicopter pilot and strategic military planner in the British Army, my co-host of the Security Brief. And Mikey, as always, you'll be delivering this brief as you would to your generals. So when it comes to what we were seeing in the Middle East and those conversations with US envoys and the Russian negotiation team, just talk us through, because I suggested there that the US team, are they getting a little bit too close to the Russians? Who are the players involved in these talks?
Well, I think it's such a good question. We mentioned the names, the Steve Witkoffs, the General Kellogg's, and there's another name that we've only just heard about, which we'll go into. But we don't really know who they are, and we've not really contrasted what their capabilities are. And I think that's what we'll do. The two meetings in Riyadh on Sunday, it was US v Russia, and it was US versus Ukraine. Incidentally, the US-Russia meeting lasted 12 hours. And the US-Ukraine meeting lasted just 1 hour. So take from that what you will. It wasn't Rubio and Lavrov this time, Rubio being the Secretary of State for the US, Lavrov being the Foreign Minister of Russia. It was two lower key players nevertheless, Steve Witkoff and a gentleman called Sergei Bezida, a name that you might not have heard in the past, or certainly a name you've not heard until recently. So slide, please. Let's go look at Steve Witkoff. Trump's special envoy to the Middle East being the operative word here, because we'll pick up on another player later on. Steve Witkoff took part in the January 2025 ceasefire negotiations between Netanyahu and Hamas. That ceasefire has been breached, as we know. But Steve Witkoff's depth of experience really lies in real estate. He was a real estate attorney, and he was a property developer and investor. So that's Steve Witkoff. That is the man who Trump put in the meeting with Russia in Saudi Arabia. Now let's go to Sergei Bezida. Slide. Sergei Bezida's credentials are a stark contrast to Steve Witkoff's. Putin's negotiation on Sunday in Saudi. He's the former head of the FSB, which is Russia's main intelligence agency. He's the head of FSB 5th Division, currently advising the head of the FSB, and he's a career intelligence officer who started his spycraft and trade in the KGB, the predecessor to the FSB. So by default and by conclusion from that, you know that Bezida has decades of experience in deceit, misinformation, malinformation, disinformation, and he knows statecraft, and more importantly, he knows how to manipulate statecraft. Then there's a third player, General Keith Kellogg. Slide. He wasn't in the meetings. He was initially ordained as Trump's special envoy to Ukraine and Russia. However, in earlier meetings, Russian officials communicated to their US counterparts that they did not want Kellogg in top-level discussions involved in ending the Ukraine war, citing Kellogg was too sympathetic to Ukraine. Now, I think what's important to bring up here, Kasia, is that Kellogg's been a general in the US military for decades. His first combat tour was in Vietnam, fighting communism, fighting the Soviets. So Putin being an enemy now is going to be deeply entrenched in Kellogg's psyche. So he's now been asked to, by Trump, to concede to Putin, step away from Russia, and now he's the special envoy just to Ukraine.
Fascinating, and it just goes to show the variation in those CVs. And when it comes to Steve Witkoff, Mikey, of course, he's going to come up, he's going to pop up a little bit later on in the Security Brief, because he was amongst those in the chat on Signal, the app that they should not have been using. We know that Steve Witkoff, he has a penchant for emojis, but we'll get onto that later.
He does, he does. And I think the reason why we sort of stipulated, or I wanted to stipulate his resume, is obviously leading on to the discussion that we'll have later on about that. But also I think it's important to understand that you've got Lavrov and Putin here that have been involved in statecraft and manipulation of statecraft for decades. These are grandmasters at geopolitical chess. And so if you're going into negotiations with these two individuals, you want someone who is equally qualified, that has that experience, that depth of experience, to basically head off at the pass what their manipulation is going to be. And I just don't see it with Steve Witkoff.
So in that case, how did those negotiations go? You said that they lasted an awful lot longer than the ones with the US and the Ukrainian negotiation team. How did Steve Witkoff do?
Well, we've been reporting on this for the security brief for a couple of weeks now. And in the last tranche of negotiations in Saudi Arabia, we had Rubio and Lavrov come out with effectively the ceasefire on energy infrastructure, which was breached within 1 hour. But attached to that was a Black Sea ceasefire in addition to that. But again, Kasia, this plays into, it's all about demands placed on Putin and what benefits Putin the most. Now, a cessation of hostilities in the Black Sea is going to likely benefit Putin more than it is Zelensky. And you may ask why. Let's go to slide and let's take a big look at the map of the region. In the top right-hand corner, you've got Crimea, and surrounded, the blue water surrounding that is the Black Sea. The only way out of that is the Bosphorus Strait. So by Putin having autonomy and protection of not just commercial shipping to the sea lines of communication, but also Russian power projection, it's through the Bosphorus Strait. Once they get into the Mediterranean, they're basically got global access to S-locks, sea lines of communication. They can go to the Suez Canal, into the Indian Ocean, or the Mediterranean, through the Strait of Gibraltar and into the Atlantic. And this Kasia, is absolutely critical because that gives Putin access to the global sea lines of communication. Not just important for the economy, but important for power projection. Now, I do have to say that in true Kremlin fashion, they've also put a caveat on this protection of shipping as well. And the caveat basically is another condition, which is the lifting of sanctions, and this is in order to make sure Black Sea shipping is safe, is the lifting of sanctions on Russian food producers and exporters is lifted. So if Trump lifts that, then these ceasefires will go ahead, and it's highly likely that Trump will.
And we're talking about these conversations, these negotiations happening in Saudi Arabia. I wonder, for those people who are saying, why there? Why particularly this country? Just talk us through why.
It's a nuanced question. I think it's a really important question because, you know, the headline is that Saudi has never been used by another US president for negotiations on this level. So why Saudi? And my analysis would say instantly go, well, follow the money is usually where I would go for a good rule. But let's take a look at some of the history and the transactions that have taken place between Trump and Saudi Arabia and MBS since 2017. We can go slide, please. We can bring some of these up. What's important is that Trump's first foreign visit after being elected in 2017 wasn't to Canada or wasn't to Mexico in usual tradition, it was to Saudi Arabia. Now, there are benefits to Saudi, of course, in terms of becoming a diplomatic player where all these negotiations are on the international stage, because it lines to MBS's vision of improving optics, if you like. But when you look at what Trump was getting, it's fascinating. So in that first visit after 2017, Trump signed a defense deal for $109 billion with MBS and Saudi Arabia. That's effectively Saudi Arabia buying $109 billion worth of military equipment from the US. When Trump left office, Trump's son, Jared Kushner, he secured a $2 billion investment from the Saudi Public Investment Fund. And then fast forward all the way to earlier this month, Saudi Arabia have pledged to commit a massive $1 trillion into the US economy. And then just a couple of days ago, we heard from the State Department that it approved a plan for a $100 million deal to sell 2,000 advanced precision kill weapons to Saudi Arabia. These weapons are basically a guided rocket system, air to ground, launched from a jet using a laser guidance system. And this is the first time that the US has ever sold these type of weapons to Saudi Arabia. I think to put it into perspective, it is important to say that the US has given $120 billion to Ukraine over 3 years. Doesn't seem like a lot when they've just got a $1 trillion investment from Saudi, and that's across humanitarian, financial, and military aid. And then I think we also have to say as well that Biden was also in a similar market for defense sales. So, for example, he sold $3 billion worth of Patriot missile systems to Saudi Arabia as well. But you just get a look at the transactional relationship between Trump and MBS. And you can get a sense as to why that Trump is prioritizing Saudi Arabia as the place for these negotiations.
And it's good for Saudi Arabia because they get an international platform.
Yeah, international platform, improving optics in terms of what MBS vision is for Saudi Arabia, making it perceived to be more liberal. I mean, it just there are quid pro quos all over the place here.
Top story this week has been, of course, that major leak of sensitive information by members of the Trump administration concerning targeted airstrikes in Yemen. Now, we've been hearing an awful lot about the signal messages themselves, but what about the broader implications for national security protocols? Well, I'm pleased to say that joining Mikey and me to discuss this and wider intelligence relations between the US and its allies is Sir Mark Lyall Grant, the UK's National Security Advisor from 2015 until 2017. So, Mark, welcome to the Security Brief. I just wonder, when we're reading these messages and the amounts of detail in them, the first thinking is, are they even necessary? These top administration staff members from the Trump administration, do they even need to be talking about this kind of attack on Yemen amongst themselves?
Well, it is the role of a national security advisor to do coordination, but I think you're right to question whether actually they needed real-time information about a military operation in Yemen. They could have been told about it after the fact. They knew it was going to happen at some point, but did they need to know the exact timings and some of the details that we've seen in this signal exchange of communications? So I think that is a legitimate question. But it is worth bearing in mind the broader point that in today's governments across the world, the use of informal messaging systems, informal communication, social media has become more common. I think what's unusual about this case is the level of classification of the information being shared.
So, Mark, it's Mikey here. Future of Five Eyes or intelligence sharing. What does, in your experience, which is quite significant, what does Europe rely on from the US in terms of intelligence sharing, and vice versa? What does the US rely on from Europe in terms of intelligence sharing, and how does that affect Five Eyes moving forward? And I can see you smiling. How does the UK, GCHQ, MI6 position themselves to either protect themselves or reimagine a future of Five Eyes in a different landscape where Putin is aligning with Trump?
Well, Mikey, I don't think you'd expect me to go into details of exactly what is shared in the Five Eyes community, of course. But let's be clear, it is a pretty deep relationship, particularly between the US and UK, but also obviously within the wider Five Eyes community. And that's been the case since the UK-USA Treaty of 1945. So it's been going on a very long time, and it's very deep. And I don't think this sort of mishap is likely to affect intelligence sharing in any serious way.
But on the broader piece, which is we are now seeing Trump aligning more with Putin, potential degradation of NATO, defunding, potentially pulling troops out. How does that affect the future of Five Eyes sharing?
Well, of course, in the longer term, it could, if some of those things you mentioned come to pass. We're not at that stage yet of NATO being undermined or the Americans withdrawing from Europe, and I hope we don't ever reach that stage. But at the moment, there's no reason to think that intelligence sharing between the two countries shouldn't continue as it has done for many years.
So in the last 6 months, Trump's behavior, the way that he's aligned to Putin, the way that he's treated Zelensky, the way that you've heard his cabinet members talking about the reliance of Europe, you don't think none of that is a worry to you at all in terms of the future of intelligence sharing?
Not in terms of future intelligence sharing. Of course, it's concerning in terms of the geopolitics and the diplomacy. That is very concerning, and I agree with a lot of what you said about the negotiations on Ukraine that have taken place in your earlier comments, Mikey. But I think intelligence sharing is a little bit different, and there is a very deeply embedded exchange between the two countries, and I don't see that being affected by this particular incident. You'll remember that when there was the possibility that Jeremy Corbyn might become Prime Minister of the United Kingdom, there was talk about would that affect intelligence sharing from the United States. Of course, it never happened. But there's been choppy waters between political leaders many times in the recent past, and that doesn't affect the sort of intelligence sharing. The relationship's a bit like an iceberg. 7/8 of it is beneath the surface, and a lot of that beneath the surface is in the nuclear defense security intelligence field, and it's not going to be affected by any sort of surface choppiness.
It's a great analogy. I'm loving that beneath the surface. On the surface, then, when it comes to the people that are dealing with this level of intelligence, talk us through the security clearances of our top leaders, and how does it compare UK politicians and, say, the US president and the members of his administration?
Well, again, I can't go into great details on that, Kasia, and I'm not fully across what the Americans do. But in the UK, anyone who gets access to secret intelligence obviously is briefed, they're read in at different levels, and they're whole different compartments of intelligence in the UK system. Some people get access to some intelligence, other people get access to more intelligence. So it is a matter of who needs to know. And I think your very first question in this interview about did all these people need to know in real time what was happening in a military operation in Yemen, I think is a valid one in that respect. That sort of information wouldn't be shared in real time in the United Kingdom, or it would be done in the sort of way that you remember that famous picture of Obama and Clinton and others in the White House Situation Room during the killing of Osama bin Laden. That is done on a secure network so that people can watch a military operation in live time. Otherwise, it's not normally necessary. Everyone could be briefed after the event, perhaps using Signal, but that wouldn't be classified because it would be after the event information.
Perhaps using Signal. Sir Mark Lyall Grant, former UK National Security Advisor, absolutely fascinating to get that lived experience. But I'm going to just push on this concept of security clearances. And you can see there Sir Mark just nimbly moving away from that question and totally professional. But Mikey, I'm going to pin you down on this. Just talk us through what you went through when you had to do security clearance.
Yeah, I was working with US intelligence. I had to go through what's called a DV, a defense vetting. I was top secret cleared, strap 3 cleared. The strap 3 bit being working with American partners. And basically it's a long interview process. They're trying to work out where you are vulnerable, as the Russians call, or we call, to compromat, which is blackmail. So they look at your finances, they look at what your relationships have been, they look at if you're part of any groups, any ideologies, what your religious persuasions are, and they try and find out where those weak points might be as you then go forward into that. And you have to be pretty tight in order to get a security clearance delivered, which is why I do think what we're seeing recently with Signalgate and other examples, I do think there are double standards. Because let's say this had been me, I would highly likely have been put forward for a court-martial, dishonorably discharged, and it wouldn't be out of the question to face jail time. So there are definitely double standards here.
Wow. And also, we know that they also look at your psychology and your family backgrounds, all of it. It's really tight. But just when it comes to then the information that is classified, and there's been a big hoo-ha in the US Senate today, the Intelligence Committee grilling some of those top members there. But talk us through what makes information classified? Because there's a big dispute about this.
Well, Kasia, I've got a brilliant example for you. Let's go to slide. This is the communications that were on Signal between members of the Trump administration. I'm going to interpret that for you, and hopefully the viewers can see that on the screen. Effectively, at the top at 12:15, you've got F-18s launch. F-18 fighter jets probably launching off a carrier. They're launching to get airborne on a strike. At 13:45, which is half an hour later, you've got trigger-based F-18 first window starts. What this means is that those jets are airborne. And if I can interpret this, then people from the FSB, the intelligence, Russian intelligence agency, can interpret this. Those jets are airborne and they're waiting for a trigger-based solution. That means they're waiting for a human intelligence input. They're waiting for an imagery intelligence input from, say, a predator or a drone, or they're waiting for an ELIN, electronic intelligence input, which is a phone call. If they get any one of those triggers, those F-18s then have permission to drop bombs on their targets. Everything in that signal message tells me that. Then it says at 14, and my eyes are struggling here actually, then it says at 14:30, you've got a second package of F-18s launching. So what that means is they're going now into the hold, and then you've got at 14:15, strike drones on target. In capital letters, this is when the first bombs will definitely drop. So you've got that trigger mechanism of F-18s. If they don't get the trigger mechanisms, then what they're saying in that signal message is at 14:15, you will have drones with air-to-ground missiles, precision-guided munitions, that irrespective of what happened on the F-18's been airborne, they will drop those bombs. And then the last bit basically tells me that the second package of F-18s that got airborne would they go in for a second strike. So
it's real time. I
will, security clearance is based on timings, it's based on code words, it's based on equipment, capability, and there's a lot in that signal message which tells me that there was a breach.
And we know, there's such a big discussion about whether it was or not, but I think they're sort of reining back in a little bit on that. Is that the last slide you have on this one? Because
it is, yeah. I mean, we've got another slide from Michael Waltz. We can go to that very, very quickly. It's just basically the bomb damage assessment. So again, in part of this signal, it was talking about, what had actually been struck. So again, it's just more information that just does not need to be out there.
Right, well, that's pretty clear, isn't it? So just when we look at what is happening in the United States, and obviously there are concerns how all of this will impact Ukraine. We heard earlier on Volodymyr Zelensky talking about who's closer, whether it's Donald Trump, whether it's closer to Putin, or whether Donald Trump is closer to Volodymyr Zelensky. He really sort of took his time and struggled to answer that. Just back to security concerns regarding the war in Ukraine. The European leaders must be worried. They're meeting again in tomorrow. The coalition of the willing. What will they be focusing? What do they need to focus on?
Kasia, we've been talking for a couple of weeks now on this idea of a peacekeeping force that has been put forward. Keir Starmer even went in front of cameras and spoke about it. So last week we spoke with Tobias Ellwood, and I asked him the questions: under what, even if there was a peacekeeping force that Putin would acquiesce to, under what framework would that exist? The framework basically cascades rules of engagement. But the big question for me regarding the peacekeeping force is that Putin and Lavrov have made quite clear from the 2021 draft proposal that was given by Lavrov to Blinken 2 months before the Russians invaded, the 22 Istanbul protocols or demands, they basically stipulated that there would never ever be entertained a peacekeeping force of NATO troops or European troops inside Ukraine. And so now they've realised this, and now they're coming back to the table and they're going to be looking at other options. And I think that's where they're trying to go now. A peacekeeping force does not exist with a ceasefire. If there's a peacekeeping force, there will be no ceasefire, so they have to go back to the drawing table.
Mikey, yes or no, with your experience formerly with the British military, will we see British troops in Ukraine? Yes or no? Putting you on the spot.
If I had $1 million in Vegas, I wouldn't put it on that.
Wow, I think that's pretty clear. Mikey K there, thank you very much for joining us on the Security Brief.